Hello again. In this video we're going to talk about the different sects in Late Second Temple Judaism in the time of Jesus and his relationship with them. In your Judaism notes you have a page that looks kind of like this that has all of these different sects I'm going to talk about, but I'm going to actually take each one of these paragraphs and make them a little bit bigger. Here's the Sadducees. Now, the Sadducees are the sect of the high priests, priestly clan, mostly aristocrats, mostly very well-to-do and powerful members of society, and again, the high priesthood associated with them. Now, remember, the high priests have been left in power by the Romans to convince the people to be good Roman citizens, and certainly to discourage any kind of a messianic type movement. And again, we're talking mainly about this Davidic Messiah that's supposed to start a war against Rome, as many of the people are hoping for. So, where are the prophecies of this Messiah, or any of the other Messiahs for that matter, located? Well, with the exception of the prophet like Moses, they're not found in the Torah. The Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, or the law of Moses, is the one that installs the priests and gives them their power, tells them how to perform all of the rituals, and as we mentioned in Second Temple Judaism is one of the 2 bases, if you will, in the Jewish religion. The other is the synagogue system and the rabbis that are teaching the common people, but the high priests and the temple are the older tradition. And the high priests do not really promote the other 2 sections of the Tanakh. Remember, the Tanakh is made up of Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, and they don't really promote those areas because in those 2 sections of the Tanakh is where you find most of the messianic prophecies. Especially in the Nevi'im, the books of the prophets, you find lots of messianic prophecies in there. And so the high priests are really promoting Torah only. Now, they're not going to come right out and say that the Nevi'im and the Ketuvim are not of God or anything like that. That would be way over the line. They're not really promoting them. They're promoting Torah only. Again, because Torah gives them their power, and because the books of the Nevi'im and some of the Ketuvim are the ones that actually have these messianic expectations in them, which they don't want people to believe in or focus on. Now, here's where it gets kind of interesting. Remember, in the Axial Age, for the first time, we have these teachings about resurrection from the dead, about final judgment and heaven and hell, about angels fighting demons and all kinds of good stuff like that. Well, guess what? The high priests don't believe in any of that stuff either. Why not? Well, it's convenient because all of those teachings are found in the same books where you find the messianic prophecies. So it really is a case that if you want to de-emphasize those books, and you want to de-emphasize the messianic prophecies in the books, you're going to have to de-emphasize all of the other things that go along with that. And again, those are the Axial Age teachings of angels and demons fighting and resurrection from the dead and final judgment and heaven and hell and all of that. So the Sadducees don't believe in any of that. If you've ever read the Gospels, there actually is a place where Jesus is in a debate with the high priest, with the Sadducees, calls them, and it actually tells you that the Sadducees do not believe in angels or heaven or resurrection or any of that. If you would like to hear the stupidest mnemonic device I ever heard in my life, a mnemonic device is something to help you remember things. It starts with a silent M, M-N-E is the way it starts. I think I was about 6 or 7 years old in Sunday school in a Presbyterian church when I was a little kid. And the Sunday school teacher was teaching us about the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Essenes. And I still remember her, old Sandy Snyder, but she said when we got to the Sadducees that they didn't believe in angels or heaven or resurrection, so they were sad, you see. How dumb is that? It's so dumb that I remember it over 50 years later. What do you know? Anyway, mnemonic devices can help you to remember things, and usually the dumber they are, the better they work. Just like TV commercials. The dumber they are, the harder it is for you to ever forget them. All right, back to this. So they don't believe in any of this kind of stuff. And again, the high priests, as we mentioned in another video, are also the main party, the ruling party, in the governing council called the Sanhedrin. Again, we mentioned that the Sadducees, the high priest, certainly not looking for any Messiah, not wanting any Davidic Messiah, and ready to help the Romans to eradicate them whenever they happen to appear. Now, the high priesthood here fabricated the charges against Jesus, saying that he was a threat to Caesar's rule, and this is what compelled the Roman prefect, Pontius Pilate, to actually crucify him. So I'm going to actually tell you some stories here about Jesus' relationship with the high priest, with the Sadducee sect, that will hopefully answer a lot of questions for you in terms of how, in fact, Jesus gets in trouble and the charges that were brought to put him to death. Through Jesus' ministry, he is based mostly in the Galilee and Galilee, out of a town called Capernaum, where a number of his disciples live. And when he's actually in that town, he stays with his disciple Simon Peter and Simon Peter's brother Andrew, who actually have a home there and have a fishing business there. But he does travel around all over the place, and he does make various trips to Jerusalem, especially for the major religious festivals. There are some people that go to all the festivals. Some people are far away and can't make it. But if you can make it, there are 3 festivals that are important for people to come to Jerusalem to observe. And they have to do with those 3 festivals that commemorate things to do with the Exodus. Pesach, or Passover, Shavuot, and also Sukkot, we talked about before. One of the 4 Gospels that tell the story of Jesus' life and teachings talks a lot more about Jesus' trips to Jerusalem for the different festivals, and that's the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John is how we know that Jesus' ministry probably lasts a good 3 years. And the reason is because every one of these festivals only happens once a year. And in the Gospel of John, we see, for instance, the Festival of Dedication, which we call the Festival of Lights, or Hanukkah, mentioned 3 times. And since it only happens once a year, those are 3 different years it's mentioned. So this is how we know that Jesus' ministry actually goes on a whole lot longer than most other messiahs, if you will. And again, as we mentioned in the last video, it's because he's not really posing any threat to Rome. When he takes these trips to Jerusalem, he often stays with friends, 3 siblings, that live in a little village called Bethany that's actually a couple miles east of Jerusalem. And he's gotten very famous. A lot of people, when they come to the festivals, are hoping that Jesus will show up, and maybe they get to see a miracle, or maybe they get to see some kind of a debate that he has with either the high priest, the Sadducees, or the Pharisees, or something. So this is good entertainment. I mean, the stories of him doing all these miracles are spreading all over the place, so he's getting pretty famous. And by word of mouth, obviously, people have found out that Jesus often stays with these 3 siblings, Mary and Martha and Lazarus, in this village of Bethany. Now, their parents are probably dead. At least it never mentions their parents. It seems like the 3 siblings share the property themselves. When Jesus comes to the festivals, the people that are hoping to see him, might actually go out to Bethany, hoping to find him when he's actually coming to or staying at the home with Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. Now, this really picks up because of one event that takes place. And that is that Lazarus actually dies. This is the younger brother. He actually dies. And Jesus is a great distance away at the time. He finally makes it to Bethany 4 days after Lazarus has been buried. Martha and Mary are very, very sad that he hasn't gotten there earlier, and say things to the effect that, if you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died, because they know that he's healed lots of people. And Jesus tells Jesus tells Martha, I'm the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. And at that point, he comes to the tomb and tells her to command to have the stone moved away from the opening of the tomb. And Martha says to him, Lord, by this time, he's going to stink. He's been in the tomb for 4 days. And Jesus says, do you want to see the glory of God or not? And so they remove the stone, and Jesus calls and says, Lazarus, come out. And Lazarus comes out, it says, wrapped, in grave clothes, think the mummy. And Jesus says, unwrap him and let him go. Well, a lot of people watch this. I mean, this is like the coolest thing they've seen in their entire life. I mean, resurrection from the dead is something they've probably never seen before, unless you happen to be at one of the other two that Jesus has already done before this one. But to see someone who has been in the grave rotting for 4 days, resurrected from the dead, that kind of tops everything. So this makes him really, really famous. And of course, all of this information gets to the high priests. And the high priests are really upset because Jesus' movement is really growing. And it makes it look like they're not doing their job to stop these messianic movements. Now, again, they've got nothing to convict him for because he hasn't said anything against Rome or anything politically controversial. But at the same time, the very fact that you've got a Mashiach with so many people following him, it really makes it look like they're not doing their job. And so they decide after this that they really need to eliminate Jesus. In John 11 and John 12 is where we're actually getting this whole story that I'm telling you here. And it says that one of the high priests, Caiaphas, says that, he says, what are we to do? For this man performs many miracles. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, which means his movement will grow, and the Romans will come and take away our place and our nation. Well, that's exactly what would happen. So, I mean, this is as historically correct as you could possibly get. In fact, we know that in 70, that's exactly what happened as the Romans came and deposed the high priests after the rebellion broke out from 66 to 70. So Caiaphas is actually the one that responds to this and says, it's better that one man perish for the whole nation so the whole nation doesn't perish. So at this point, he isn't really saying that Jesus is guilty of anything, but he's saying he's got to die. I mean, this movement is growing, and, if we don't stop it, the Romans are going to come and depose us, so we've got to figure out a way to eliminate him. So at this point, they're planning to kill Jesus. The next major festival that's coming up is Passover, or Pesach. And this last Passover is the one where Jesus actually is going to be arrested and crucified. But when he comes to this festival of Passover, and he knows, by the way, this is going to happen, he's told his disciples, though, as I mentioned in the last video, they can't quite wrap their heads around it. But when he comes to the festival in Jerusalem, of course, they stay out in Bethany with Mary and Martha and Lazarus, who's risen from the dead. And because of this, many people believe on Jesus. And there's a large crowd of them there to see Jesus in Bethany, and also to, see Lazarus, who's been raised from the dead. I mean, this is a big deal. So there's a huge crowd of people waiting there. And everybody knows that he's coming. Everybody's anticipating and, hoping they get to see some kind of miracle or debate or something. The high priests, as I said, are already decided they need Jesus going. But Jesus is going to do a few more things to really make them angry before they get their way. The first thing is, when he actually goes into the city, enters for the Passover festival coming from Bethany, at this point, he is so popular that there are huge crowds of people waiting for him, and they're, laying their coats and palm branches and stuff in the path before him, which is a showing of reverence. And they're crying out things like, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, the King of Israel. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest. And we see this both in the Gospels. Gospels of John, Luke, and Matthew all have this story of him coming into Jerusalem. Of course, this makes the high priest furious. I mean, maybe Jesus isn't claiming to be a Mashiach in the sense of a Davidic warrior, but that's what people are calling him, and that's apparently something that they think is associated with his ministry. So this looks really bad. And in Jerusalem, this is where the Antonia fortress is at. So, I mean, the Romans are watching this whole thing. And so, again, the high priest, this looks really bad for them. But Jesus is not done upsetting them yet. The next thing he does is he goes into the temple, and he actually, we read about this in Matthew, in Luke, and in Mark, and he goes in and he actually ejects all of the people that are doing business on the Temple Mount. And the main kinds of business that are happening up there is people are selling sacrificial animals, and they're changing money to pay the temple tax. Sacrificial animals, this is interesting. When you bring an animal to sacrifice to the temple, it has to be without spot or blemish. And clearly there's going to be some kind of a priestly representative examining the animal from head to toe before the animal is judged to be okay to be used for the sacrifice. And I'm sure there are many people who have, taken a long trip on foot with families and children and animals and everything and get to Jerusalem, and only for somebody in the priestly clan to say, oh, there's a mole here, right behind his left ear. I'm sorry, we can't use him. And you've done all the work to bring the animals for nothing. So a lot of people probably opt to just go ahead and buy their animals there if they can afford it. And some who had not opted for that will have the the unfortunate surprise of having to buy an animal because theirs isn't good enough. So this is big business. Now, there are vendors down on the level of the city streets selling animals, and it doesn't seem like that's what Jesus is concerned with. It seems like it's the vendors that have actually moved up to the top of the Temple Mount. The actual temple courts is only part of the Temple Mount. There's a big area outside of that, and apparently they've moved up there selling their animals. We also have money changers. And strangely enough, the temple tax is supposed to be paid with a Syrophoenician coin. But this is not the kind of coin that most people have, so you have to change your money to get the correct denomination. And of course, the money changers are charging some kind of a percentage or something. If they're down on the city street, that's one thing, but the ones that are up on the Temple Mount, this seems to be the ones that Jesus is concerned with. Now, these people doing business on the Temple Mount, obviously, they paid a premium to get up there. And the high priests are making some kind of a cut of everything that they're selling. And Jesus is furious, and he says he actually makes a whip, a multi-corded whip, and drives them all off the Temple Mount. And, he's dumping their tables over, dumping their money on the floor, letting the animals out of the cages. And he literally drives them off the Temple Mount. And now, by the way, I don't know if you've watched any movies where you have some nice Victorian actor playing Jesus going, take these things hence, make not my Father's house a house of merchandise. If anybody talked like that, all of the vendors would laugh at him. For him to successfully kick all of these vendors off the Temple Mount, he's got to be a badass. He's literally whipping them, raising welts on them. They've got to be afraid of him. So, you don't get people off the Temple Mount by nicely asking. So he is really kind of an ethical badass here. It says that his disciples, when they see this, remember, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you make it a den of robbers. And this is something in the scriptures that they remember, and they realize, oh, this is the fulfillment of this. Now, this is not the first time he's done this, by the way. Near the beginning of his ministry, John actually records another time where he goes into the temple and does this. So at this point, he's really making the priests angry. This is their home territory. Where does he think he gets the power to do this? But he's not done upsetting them yet. One more thing has to happen. As he comes out of the temple, his disciples, by the way, this particular story is in, again, both Mark and Luke and Matthew. But as he comes out of the temple, his disciples are noticing the exquisite Herodian stonework and how amazing these buildings all look. And Jesus says, you see all these? There will not be one stone left on top of another. So he's prophesying the utter destruction of the temple, not just the destruction, but literally not one stone will be left on top of another. Now, these are huge stones, by the way, that have been cut. And now he's telling this to his disciples, but of course, there's people all around Jesus, and the high priest certainly hear this, and this has got to have made them really angry. He's taken control of the Temple Mount, he's kicked off all of the vendors, and now he's prophesying that the temple's going to be destroyed. What would cause the temple to be destroyed? Well, if a rebellion broke out, and as a result the Romans came and deposed the high priest and destroyed the temple, which, as we know, actually happened in 70 CE, about 40 years later. That's when Jesus' prophecy comes true. But at the time, how insulting must this seem? Because the only movement that's large enough that they're worried about at the time is Jesus' own movement. So when he's prophesying the destruction of the temple, maybe they think that he's in some way indicating that his movement is going to get so big that the high priests are going to come and destroy the temple. I don't know. But this is the last straw, and they need him gone right away. And they managed to find a disgruntled disciple. You've probably heard of Judas Iscariot. he makes a deal with them for 30 pieces of silver to tell them how they can apprehend Jesus. Because when he's in the temple, he's surrounded by crowds that just love him. And the high priest really can't arrest him. They're afraid that if they try, the people will, rebel and it'll be a bad scene. So they need to get him alone when he's not surrounded by his adoring followers. So this betraying disciple who's mad because Jesus actually rebuked him for something to do with money. He was actually the treasurer and apparently not completely honest. But he tells him that you can find Jesus in a place called Gethsemane. Now, when you're going out of Jerusalem and you're going out of the eastern gate, they call the Golden Gate, you go across the Kidron Valley, you go up over the Mount of Olives, and then down a small decline into the village of Bethany. But, after all day, climbing up all the way up the Mount of Olives can be a little bit tiring. And so there's a place a certain way up the hill where they would stop and take a break. And it was called Gethsemane, which really means oil press. And it's actually a grotto, a cave, where there's a big oil press. And outside of the cave, there's a garden full of olive trees, which is where we get the oil, that's called the Garden of Gethsemane. So Jesus, in the grotto, this is where he would stop and rest with his disciples. So that's exactly what Judas Iscariot tells the high priest, and that's where they come to arrest him. Now, when they come to arrest him, he's actually outside in the garden, praying when they actually come and arrest him. Now, I'm not going to tell you the whole story of this because I want to tell you about what happens the next day. In the last video, we talked about Jesus before the high priest and the blasphemy of him claiming to be the Son of Man that Daniel saw, and that he's going to come in the heavens with the armies of God, and the blasphemy that makes the high priest want to kill him. Now, the problem is, though, that the high priests are not happy to just take him and stone him or something like that. They're not allowed to put Jesus to death, at least not in the way they want to. They want him crucified. Why do they want him crucified? Crucified, you're actually nailed up on a huge cross up off the ground where everybody that comes in and out of Jerusalem can see these criminals up on the cross and see the judgment for their crimes. And that's where they want Jesus. Why? Well, obviously, because you've got this multitude of Jews that have welcomed him and sung all these hymns to him and Hosanna to the Son of God. And, they want him dead. They want all of these people that have seen him, they want them all to see him dying on a cross so they know he's not the Messiah. So they know this is what happens when you mess with the high priests. It's not enough to have some, private stoning somewhere. Everybody has to see it. Now, the problem is they can't condemn somebody to death by crucifixion. That's a Roman form of punishment, of death. That usually is reserved for the worst criminals, usually those who are insurrectionists, starting some kind of rebellion against Rome, murderers, this kind of thing. But that's the way they want Jesus to be killed. So they bring Jesus to the Roman prefect in Jerusalem, whose name is Pontius Pilate. Maybe you've heard of him. To make a long story really short, Pontius Pilate just really can't find anything wrong with Jesus, except that he seems to have upset the high priests in some way that has to do with their theology, which Pontius Pilate just really does not care about. But he doesn't seem to have broken any Roman laws. Finally, what ends up happening is the high priests and their cronies, they're meeting in a place called the Pavement, Gabbatha, in front of Pilate. It's a place that probably holds a couple hundred people. So there is a crowd there that wants Jesus to be crucified. But they are the high priests and their cronies. These are not the same people, the thousands of people that loved Jesus, the day before. Common misconception that somehow these thousands of people loved Jesus one day, and then for some inexplicable reason, the next day they all want him dead. That makes no sense. If something makes no sense, question it. So this is a different group of people, a smaller group of people that are allied with the purposes of the high priest. And finally, what they realize is the only way they're going to be able to get Pilate to put Jesus to death is to accuse him of something that people are crucified for. What are people crucified for? Insurrection, rebellion against Rome, challenges to Caesar. And so what they do is they tell Pilate that Jesus claimed to be a king. And of course, his kingdom's not of this earth, but they tell him that he claims to be a king. Anyone that calls himself a king speaks against Caesar. If you let Jesus go, Pilate, you are not Caesar's friend. They've got him. Much as Pilate probably considers the high priest a pain in the butt, they've got him. Because if he lets Jesus go at this point, they'll just say, hey, we had evidence that he was plotting against Rome, and Pilate let him go anyway. And Pilate's life would probably be forfeit at that point. So at this point, Pilate knows he has to do what they want. So he comes out and sits down in this place, the pavement, and ritually washes his hands before them and says, I'm innocent of the blood of this man. You might have heard the metaphor that when you shed innocent blood, you stand before God with that blood on your hands at the last judgment. Well, this is exactly what the symbolism is. He's saying, my hands are clean. I find no fault in the guy at all. I think he's innocent, but you forced me to do this, but I know your charges are bullshit. So Pilate's last little dig here is that when he has the plaque that is supposed to state the charges against Jesus that's going to be nailed to his cross, it says, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And he has it, of course, in 3 different languages. And the high priests are upset, and they say, no, make the sign say, he said he was the King of the Jews. And Pilate says, nah, what I've written, I've written. So that's his final little, dig against the high priest. But they get their way, and that way all of these thousands of people that have loved Jesus, when they come into Jerusalem the next day, they see him up on the cross dying, and their hopes are shattered. And at that point, they realize he can't be the Messiah. And remember from the last video, every conception of the Messiah they've ever thought of, the Messiah is victorious and goes on forever. Certainly the high priest would not have been able to successfully nail him to a cross or have him nailed to the cross if indeed he was the Messiah. So this is the end of their hopes. Now, going on, we know, I think you probably have heard the story, that on the 3rd day after he's buried, he does rise from the dead. And this is when his movement just absolutely explodes. But that's another story for another day. I wanted you to understand a bit about his relationship with the high priest, the Sadducees. And I want you to realize they're the ones that are most responsible for putting him to death. There certainly are some Pharisees that wanted to see him dead too, but they're not the ones that really instigate these proceedings. They're not the ones that really need him dead. The high priests are the ones whose reputation and whose occupation and whose well-being hangs in the balance if they're seen to have not done their job. So let's move on now to the Pharisees, shall we? A lot of people think the Pharisees are the worst enemies of Jesus, and that actually is not true. The reason people think that is because there's so many arguments, so many debates that are recorded in the Gospels where Jesus is challenging the Pharisees and their scribes. By the way, a scribe is a fancy word for a doctor of the law, and we mean the law of Moses. So you can think a theologian, if you will. And, all the major groups, I'm sure, have their scribes, they're experts in the law. But usually when Jesus is talking about scribes and Pharisees, he's talking about the scribes of the Pharisees. Anyway, Jesus' teachings are actually closest to the teachings of the Pharisees. They're messianic. They believe in the whole Tanakh, not just the Torah. They believe in the messianic prophecies about the Messiah coming. But they have many reasons to believe that Jesus probably isn't the Messiah. But the biggest thing that bothers the Pharisees is that Jesus' disciples don't seem to be being instructed the correct way, in their opinion. Now, when we talk about the rabbis that have gotten famous in the synagogue system, that are heroes of the common people, the elders of the people, that are telling the people how to walk with God every day to please God, the rabbis that we see in the Gospels are generally from the sect of the Pharisees. They're the Pharisee rabbis. In fact, after the temple is destroyed in 70 CE, as we said before, this is the sect that lives on, that has the authority in Judaism now. When the high priests are removed, the rabbis are the ones that have all the authority in Judaism, and they have a very different theology than the high priest. The high priest theology really dies with them. So the Pharisees, they do believe in messianic claims, but they have many different opinions regarding it, interpretations of it. There's subsects of the Pharisees. But again, the rabbis have disciples. Every one of the major rabbis will have a small group of close disciples, that are getting a more intense training than anyone else, and they're supposed to take over after the rabbi dies and promote the teachings. And Jesus looks just like them. He's got, 12 close disciples that he's teaching, but then a much larger group that's following him around, like a lot of the major rabbis. And he's seen as a major rabbi, and the other rabbis probably can't figure out why he's not a card-carrying Pharisee, so to speak. But he actually challenges a lot of the ideas that the Pharisees teach, which is what gets him in trouble. Now, one of the things about the Pharisees is that I mentioned they teach people how to walk according to the Mosaic law. Why do they need to be taught that? Why can't they just read the law? Well, realize, depending on how you date the Exodus, it's between 1,300 and 1,500 years since the Torah, since the law of Moses. A lot of things happen in 1,500 years. I mean, we've gone through many empires since then, from the Assyrian to the Babylonian, to the Persian, to the Greek, to the Ptolemaic, to the Seleucid, and finally to the Roman Empire. Things have changed a lot. We've gone through the Axial Age. Greek culture has been spread all over the empire. So things are very different. And it's much like if you were trying to read something in your Bible today and trying to figure out how to apply it correctly in the 21st century, you might have some problems because these things are written to people in a very different kind of society. So there's definitely some interpretation that needs to be done. So there's nothing wrong with the fact that they're providing this service. But what's developed over the centuries is kind of a secondary Torah, and they call it the oral Torah. It is something that is a tradition among the rabbis, and they pass it on to their disciples, and they pass it on to their disciples, and it goes on for generations. But it's the authoritative Torah of the Pharisees. And they believe it goes all the way back to, the law of Moses, but, you can think what you believe about that. So they give Jesus a lot of crap because he does not seem to respect their interpretation of the Torah, and he is not teaching his disciples how to follow their oral Torah. Now, in the Gospels, it calls this the tradition of the elders. Scholars usually call it the oral Torah. And as we'll find out later on, after the temple is destroyed, and then after the second revolt, when the Jews are actually kicked out of their land in 135, the Pharisees, for the first time, see a need to actually write down this oral Torah. And so near the end of the 2nd century CE, they finally write the whole thing down. And at that point, it's called the Mishnah, which means the repetition, because it was repeated orally before that time. Anyway, a lot of the debates that Jesus has with the Pharisees has to do with their interpretation of Torah. That is, their authoritative way of telling people how they're supposed to keep Torah. And Jesus has a big problem with them because they seem to be judging people according to their traditions rather than according to God's law. There are many other things he has a problem with them for. He frequently rebukes the Pharisee leaders for hypocrisy, which is a fancy word for posturing or acting, if you will. In fact, the word hypocrite is actually used for an actor in the Greek plays and so on. By the way, if you are an actor and somebody calls you a big hypocrite, it's probably a compliment. We give awards to hypocrites in our society, Oscars, Golden Globes. But if you're a religious leader and somebody calls you an actor, that is no longer a compliment. That's saying you're disingenuous. That's saying your faith is not for real. And so that very much offends them. And Jesus has many things that he takes them to task for. In the second video from this one, when we talk about the teachings of Jesus, we're going to get way in depth with a lot of the arguments that he has over ethical issues and issues of the law with the Pharisees. Very interesting, by the way, if you want to understand why he makes the Pharisees so angry. Now, but this is important for now. I want you to understand, the Pharisees really do not have a theological or a political reason to need Jesus dead. That's the high priest. That's the Sadducees. But Jesus really does make some of the Pharisee rabbis angry because he airs them. He rebukes them publicly and airs their dirty laundry in front of the crowds that have come to hear the debate. And that includes all of their disciples, all of Jesus's disciples, and many other people who are hearing this debate. So he is publicly disgracing them, rebuking them. And that makes them very angry. So as a sect, maybe they don't have a real reason to need Jesus dead, but there are some key Pharisees that are very angry because of the way Jesus has defamed them and disrespected them in public. And it does tell you after some of these confrontations that some of these major Pharisees, they leave trying to figure out how they can have Jesus killed. But they never actually do. It actually is the high priests, of course, that end up having him killed. So the high priests are the worst enemies of Jesus. They're the ones, the Sadducees, that promote his death and get it done. But he does offend some of the Pharisees. Now, again, we'll talk later about the conflicts with them. But I want to stress a couple things. One more time. The theology of the Pharisees is not that different from Jesus's. The main issue would be their personal integrity, their personal hypocrisy, their personal unethical practices, and how much emphasis they put on the oral Torah and the necessity to follow it just like they say, as if their tradition, as if God was judging just as much by their tradition as God was judging by his law in the first place. And Jesus, of course, has a problem with this. Second thing, many of the Pharisees actually convert. There are more converts from the Pharisee than any other sect. And we see this later on in the book of Acts. There is a passage where we see that some of the members of the Jerusalem church are Pharisees, converted Pharisees. And this makes sense. You don't have to stop being a Pharisee to follow Jesus or believe he's the Messiah. His teachings are not that far. Now, if you happen to be a Sadducee and you want to follow Jesus, well, yeah, you can't keep being a Sadducee. Because Sadducees don't believe in a lot of the things that Jesus is teaching. So you can't be a Sadducee and follow Jesus, but you can be a Pharisee and follow Jesus. The doctrines are not so far off. Again, we'll talk more about the Pharisees later. And remember, the Pharisees are the sect from which comes the rabbis. When we talk about rabbinic Judaism after the destruction of the temple, the theology of the Pharisee rabbis is what lives on. So Orthodox Judaism today, technically, their leaders are the theological descendants, if you will, of the first century Pharisee rabbis. Next, we have the sect of the Essenes. Remember when we talked about the monastic community on the northwest shores of the Dead Sea at Qumran, the ones that preserved the Dead Sea Scrolls, the ones that I said, some scholars, including me, believe that they actually are the deposed Zadokite priests after the Maccabean revolt. Remember we talked about them? Well, these Qumranites, if you want to call them that, are part of the sect called the Essenes. And we knew that even before we found the Dead Sea Scrolls because of the writings of Josephus and some others. But with the Dead Sea Scrolls, we found out a lot about this sect. We found out about what they believe. We found out about the rules of their community. We found out about what they thought about other sects in terms of a lot of critique of the Pharisees, but especially of the Sadducees in Jerusalem. Remember, these priests are the Hasmoneans, or the descendants of the ones that we've nicknamed the Maccabees that start the Maccabean revolt. And so there's a lot of criticism of them we've seen in the Dead Sea Scrolls. But what I want to talk about now is just what they believe. The Essenes are the most apocalyptic. I mean, they're sure they're in the last days. Some of the Pharisees think so, some of them don't. They're all eschatological, some are apocalyptic. But the Essenes, they're very apocalyptic. They believe they're in the last days. They're waiting for Messiah to come. They think they're going to have the final battle against the Romans, and God's kingdom is going to be set up on earth. And of course, when the battle breaks out in 66, it doesn't end up the way they want. In 70, when the Romans have won and they've destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, they come to wipe out the remainder of the rebels that are out in the Judean wilderness, including the rebels that are holed up on Masada, but first, the ones at Qumran. And so these very educated priestly scribes, they do not want all of these different scrolls that they've been preserving and copying and writing to be destroyed by the Romans. So they seal them in ceramic jars and hide them in the different caves all around the Marl Terrace around Qumran, so the Romans won't destroy them when the Romans destroy the Essenes, which they did. And we did not start finding these scrolls until 1948. So, I mean, they were in there almost 1900 years before we even knew that they existed. But as I mentioned before, the finding of the Dead Sea Scrolls has revolutionized our knowledge of late Second Temple Judaism, or you might say Judaisms, because there's so many different varieties. But anyway, we have no information whatsoever about Jesus's relationship with the Essenes, with this particular sect, though lots of scholars love to speculate about that. The Zealots are not really a religious sect, so to speak. These are common people that they want to start the war against Rome yesterday. So these Zealots are involved in guerrilla warfare against the Romans. And by the way, many stories of different towns completely destroyed when the Romans found out that they were harboring Zealots there. But the Zealots, again, they're not waiting for Messiah to appear. They think that they want to start the war right now. And they have this kind of, if you've ever seen the movie Field of Dreams, Kevin Costner keeps hearing this mysterious voice going, "If you build it, he will come." Well, that's kind of the way they feel. If they get the war against Rome started, God will reward their faith by having the Messiah come to lead them. So what's Jesus' relationship with them? This is a no-brainer. He's a huge disappointment. Here's a guy that can do all kinds of miracles that could probably defeat the whole Roman army with no problem, and yet he has no interest whatsoever in starting a war against Rome. So the Zealots are probably pretty disappointed in him. Lastly, let's talk about the Samaritans. Hello? There we go. Now, Samaritans are not Jews. Samaritans are actually Israelites. Remember, Israelites are all descendants of Israel, but Jews are either descendants of the tribe of Judah, or they're descendants of people that were part of the southern kingdom of Judah after the split. Remember that idiot Rehoboam, the son of Solomon? So the Samaritans are actually despised by the Jews. And the Jews will not even go in the area where they live, which is called Samaria. They were the descendants of the very, very few survivors when the Assyrian destroyed the 10 northern tribes of Israel and took them all captive. Just a few of them that survived. And some of them, it may be because, they were very, very pretty Israelite women that some of the Assyrian commanders said, "Oh, I'll take her, and that happens a lot when you've got officers for a long period of time out of their country in battle. When you're taking people captive and they see some beautiful women, they decide to take them for themselves So anyway, the next generation of these Israelites are actually mixed blood between the Israelite 10 northern tribes and the Assyrians. And later on, after the Assyrians are conquered, they interbreed with different kinds of indigenous groups, the Canaanites, different tribes. So the first thing is they're mixed blood, okay? Now, remember, with the split, they did not go to Jerusalem to worship at the temple anymore because they were enemies with the kingdom of Judah to the south of them. And to this day, they still don't go to Jerusalem to worship. They worship on their own mountain, Mount Gerizim. So here are the things that Jews despise about them. Number one, they're descendants of the Israelite tribes that defected from the nation that was ruled by Judah, by the Davidic kings. And secondly, they're not even pure-blooded Israelites. They have a lot of impure blood in their bloodline. And thirdly, they do not go to Jerusalem. They won't worship at the temple. So they're not only despised, they're considered ritually unclean. Jews are supposed to have nothing to do with them. And if you're a scribe, if you're a Jewish theologian, you can give someone all kinds of good reasons why it is not God's will that you have anything to do with them. They can give you lots of reasons why these people are cursed, why they are no longer worthy of God's covenant. Jesus does not buy this at all. Jesus does not despise them. In fact, a lot of people won't even go through Samaria on the way to Jerusalem because they don't want to become ritually unclean on the way to the temple. Jesus has no problem. He goes right through their land. He stops and talks to them, stays in their cities. He does not embrace this prejudice at all. He sees them as children of Israel to whom the promises still pertain. And there's one interesting story about how Jesus really offends probably a Jewish theologian who comes to him and asks him, what is the greatest commandment? And you can find this in Luke 10:25. It's one of the two most famous parables that Jesus teaches. It's called the parable of the Good Samaritan. And we'll talk about the other one in one of the next videos. Parable of the Good Samaritan. Now, you probably didn't know Samaritans were despised, but now you do. So, a scribe, that is to say a lawyer of the Mosaic law, tests Jesus and says, "Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus throws it right back at him. I mean, he's a scribe after all. says, what's written in the law? How do you read it? And the scribe answers the correct way. This, by the way, is not unique. This is kind of an agreed upon thing in terms of what the greatest commandment is. The scribe answers and he says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Now the first comes from Deuteronomy, and the second comes from Leviticus. And so Jesus answered and said, correct, do this and you'll live. But it says, the scribe, willing to justify himself, says to Jesus, yeah, but who's my neighbor? Now remember, we talked about this all the way back in the beginning of the semester. All the religions agree that the highest ethic is to love your neighbor as yourself. The question is, who is your neighbor? And some, especially Christian groups and Muslim groups, have a lot of theologies explaining why a lot of the people on earth are not their neighbor. They're the enemies of God, and therefore they don't have to love them, because God's just waiting to destroy them anyway. Well, that's exactly the way the Jews feel about the Samaritans. So when this scribe says, yeah, love your neighbor as yourself, but who's my neighbor? He's not asking who it's okay to love. He has some opinions about who he doesn't have to love, and he wants to make sure that his exclusions are in fact accepted by Jesus. Well, of course they're not. So when he says, who's my neighbor? Jesus starts telling a story. And by the way, this is what rabbis do. They're famous for telling stories, so he's not at all amazed by this. He's going to listen to the story. What he doesn't know is that Jesus is not really going to answer his question because he didn't ask the right question. He shouldn't have asked, who's my neighbor? He should have asked, how do I be a good neighbor? But anyway, Jesus tells a story. And he says that there's a man in the Judean wilderness, a Jew, who gets waylaid by robbers, and they severely wound him. He's going to die. He's got mortal wounds. They've stolen everything. He's by the side of the road, puddle of blood, whatever, dying. And along comes a priest on the way to Jerusalem, and he just makes a big arc around the guy and keeps going on his way. And after that, there comes a Levite. By the way, all priests are Levites, but when you talk about priests and Levites, usually when you say Levite, you mean someone of a priestly clan, but not someone who's actually performing rituals. They have some kind of a lesser job they do at the temple. But anyway, still concerned with staying ritually clean, the Levite comes, sees him, makes a big circle around him, and goes on his way. They won't go near him, which would make them ritually unclean, obviously. Certainly dead bodies, blood, contagious diseases, or even contact with someone that's not a Jew. Who knows if they can tell if he's even a Jew in the condition he's in. So they won't stop and help him. Well, along comes a Samaritan. Does he care about becoming ritually unclean? Not at all. He's considered ritually unclean by Jews his whole life. He doesn't care. But he has compassion on the guy, and he helps him. And he saves the guy's life. I mean, literally spends a lot of money to get him the care that he needs, and the guy lives because of him. That's the end of the story. At the end of the story, Jesus turns back to the scribe and says, so who was the neighbor to the man who fell among thieves? And now the scribe realizes he's been had. Jesus isn't answering his question. Jesus objects to the whole premise of his question. Jesus is answering the question he should have asked. And so Jesus says, who was the good neighbor? And of course, the scribe replies, the one that showed mercy. Notice he doesn't say Samaritan. He objects to the whole idea that a Samaritan could be more righteous than a Jew, but he realizes he's been had, and he answers, yes, the one that showed him mercy. And Jesus says, go and do thou likewise. So he's in a sense asking, who don't I have to love? And Jesus is telling him not just that he has to love a Samaritan, but that he should do as the Samaritan did. Now that's something that would be a real problem today. Think of someone or some group of people that your particular religion would consider to be damned, okay, rejected by God. And imagine that they were the hero of the story. Imagine a woman's broken down on the freeway, and it's on a Sunday morning, and along comes a pastor on the way to church, and he's late, and he's got 5,000 people waiting to hear a sermon from him that nobody else can preach. And he sees the woman and thinks, I hope somebody else comes and helps her, but he can't stop. He's on his way to church. And along comes a Catholic priest that's on his way to Mass, and he looks at the woman and goes, man, I'm late, and I've got to be there, and so I can't stop. I mean, This is my service to God, they're both thinking, and my service to God is more important. Kind of like the priest and the Levite thinking, I can't become ritually unclean because the service I have to perform when I get to Jerusalem, that's more important. But after the pastor and after the Catholic priest, along comes somebody else who stops to help the woman. This guy's not going to church or to the Catholic Mass. He stops and helps the woman. And, she's on the side of the road, behind the guardrail with her 2 kids while her car's smoking, and so he pulls up and uses his AAA membership to get her car towed to a mechanic that's a friend of his. And his friend takes a look at the car while he takes the woman and her 2 kids out to buy him something to eat for lunch. Comes back and the mechanic tells him privately, he says, look, blown a head gasket, big deal. And the guy says, look, take care of it. How quick can you get it done? I'll cover it. So then he takes them out to Busch Gardens and they go on all the rides and the woman and her kids have a wonderful day. And at the end of the day, he takes them back to his friend's mechanic shop where the car is finally done, goes in the back and settles the bill, which is quite expensive. But he comes out and tells the woman, no big deal, I took care of it and happy to help, and sends her on her way. What a wonderful guy. What a hero. By the way, did I mention that he was an atheist transvestite? Now imagine standing up in front of a conservative Protestant church, or Catholic for that matter, and telling this story about the man that helped the woman out. Nothing wrong with the story, except that you made the hero of the story someone that is considered to be damned and going to hell. It's not okay to stand up in front of First Baptist Church and teach about how Jesus wants you to live and use an atheist transvestite as an example. That's not okay. That's offensive. And that's just about as offensive as it was for Jesus to use a despised Samaritan as a hero in his story about how God wants you to love your neighbor. Wow. That's all for this one. I'll see you for the next video.